Social Justice Lunch Series, and today's topic is examining the impact of race on mass incarceration and excessive sentencing. My name is Michelle Fukawa, and I am the Assistant Director for the Center for Civil and Human Rights here at Gonzaga Law School. And this is our second fall presentation in our Social Justice Lunch Series. And the goal of this series is to bring notable speakers to GU Law to talk about issues central to the mission of our center, including promoting access to justice and helping individuals and communities that are marginalized and disadvantaged. Please take note that today's presentation is being recorded, and today's presentation will be moderated by Professor Mary Pat Truthart, Professor of Law at Gonzaga Law School. Professor Truthart teaches constitutional law, criminal procedure, international human rights, mental disability law, and women's rights. And I'm going to turn the virtual mic over to Professor Truthart to introduce our featured speakers today.
Michelle, thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to be here and to moderate this presentation on behalf of the Center for Civil and Human Rights at Gonzaga. And as you indicated, I think that I'm in a pretty good position to talk about some of these issues or to moderate this discussion because of my interest in criminal justice, the criminal legal system, and so forth. Most important, I am happy to be on this panel because I have been a friend and colleague of George Critchlow, Professor Emeritus from Gonzaga Law School for more than 30 years. So he was one of the first people who befriended me when I came to Gonzaga in 1989. And I'm also thrilled to be joined by Jeremiah Bourgeois. And Jeremiah, please, this is one of the moderator failings. So note to everyone in the future, wear pants, and I have them, and learn how to pronounce the name of all the panelists correctly. So Jeremiah, who also goes by JJ, do you want to pronounce your name for me?
You had it right. It is Bourgeois.
Okay, just checking, trying to stay on top of things. So we're here today to do a couple of different things. And I think that we are going to be looking at larger issues of mass incarceration and extreme sentencing, but we're going to be using sort of a phenomenological critique to examine those larger issues. And most notably, we're going to look at the recent book and hear a discussion about the recent book authored by Professor George Critchlow, titled The Lifer and the Lawyer. I think that it will be released sometime soon, and George, maybe you can give us an update on its actual publication date. But it tells the story of George's ongoing relationship for more than 40 years with a man who he represented in the Tri-Cities on a myriad of criminal charges. And I think that he'll tell us a little bit more about the specifics as we proceed. I think the book is extremely well crafted, of course, because George is an excellent writer. I also have to touch base with him later because there are a couple of incidents in the book where he could have mentioned my name and he did not. So we'll talk about that separately. But I think that if we look at these issues of mass incarceration and excessive sentencing or extreme sentencing, please know that there is a lot of statistical information out there that will is available for our review or purview with respect to these issues. Now, I think some of the best available resources come from the Brennan Center, which is based out of New York. It's a New York University affiliated center, and it is really focused on looking at some of these issues. Of course, the ACLU has had a long history of concern about mass incarceration as well as excessive or extreme sentencing. And finally, many of you might be familiar with the work of Brian Stevenson through the Equal Justice Initiative. I had the opportunity to visit Montgomery, Alabama last year and go to its museum, which is very much focused on an interactive experience dealing with the legacy of slavery, but more important for modern or for current times, looking at these issues of mass incarceration and extreme sentencing, which do have a much greater and disproportionate impact on men of color. And so, again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that Civil Rights Memorial Tour of the South as a prime vacation destination, because it's very challenging to hear these stories, to see these memorials, and to understand our history. But I think it's important that we put this in a larger context. So I think that, so George is joining us as an author. Jeremiah, which I think is going to be his lawyer name rather than JJ, but either way, he is joining us because he is currently a law student in our executive JD program who has his own experiences with the criminal legal system. And so he will be sharing some of those with you momentarily. So I think that, again, the book covers a variety of subjects, but most important, it's about the relationship between a lawyer and client. It's about a friendship that develops. It's about some of these larger issues, especially in the epilogue of the book. George speaks directly to mass incarceration and the whole notion of extreme sentencing. I think we may have the opportunity through questions and so forth to discuss some reform initiatives that have been successful or that have been proposed in the recent past. But I do want to turn things over. I'll ask a couple of questions and facilitate our discussion. But I guess the first question that I would have is, George, why are you telling this story now?
Let me get into the human side of this story in just a moment, but I want to set the stage with a statistic or a couple of statistics. The book itself is about a human story, a relationship, and the impact of a life sentence on my friend, Michael Anderson. But in case we run out of time, I just want to set the stage with a couple of statistics. In 1984, there were about 34,000 people in the United States who were in prison on life sentences. In 2016, there were 162,000 people in the United States on life sentences. 48% of those people were African American, 15% were Latino. A sizable majority of these increased life sentences over the last 50 or 60 years are people of color. The next thing is that there are more people in prison currently sentenced to life than there were all prisoners in 1972. The increase in life sentencing, as well as just the increase overall in imprisoning people in the United States, which does affect people of color disproportionately, is just amazing. It's extraordinary. And when we start our discussion from that sort of baseline, it helps us understand this human story that involves Michael Anderson and my relationship with him, because he's one of those people who is part of those statistics. But in my life, he has also become a friend who I've become intimately acquainted with, not only in terms of his present situation, but in terms of having known him now for over 40 years. So your question, Mary Pat, again, was to get me started about the book was what?
Basically, why write this book now? Either in your life or because of what's happening generally, our discussions about some of these issues.
So I'm very concerned because I've taught criminal procedure, I've practiced criminal law, I know something about the criminal justice system, and I know something about the effect of racism and our history of racism on people of color. Because of that sort of general orientation and knowledge I've had, plus the fact that I happen to represent Michael Anderson over 40 years ago, I got into a discussion with him in the last couple of years about the idea of using his life as an opportunity to describe the criminal justice system as it impacts people who are sentenced to life, and in this case, particularly a person of color. I represented Michael when I was a young lawyer just out of law school in the late 70s. He was a young man who had come to the Tri-Cities here in Eastern Washington after having been raised in poverty, in an environment of neglect and abuse when he was a kid. He was a few years younger than I, but he had suffered a young life of real deprivation and neglect and abuse, which resulted in him spending a lot of time in juvenile detention and prisons in Illinois. He and his girlfriend and a couple of kids, when he was in his early 20s, decided to flee Illinois and his background and his environment in the south side of Chicago and come to Eastern Washington, of all places. I happened to come from the Tri-Cities, and after law school, I ended up practicing law in my father's firm down in Richland, Washington. Within a year or so after I started practice, a court, a local judge, appointed me to represent Michael Anderson on 22 serious felonies. He, in fact, had not been able to successfully leave his criminal life behind in Chicago. He got out here to the Tri-Cities and continued a life of serious criminal activity and violence. He was a man who hurt people. So I'm a young lawyer. I matched up with him. I worked hard for him at the time. That started our relationship. That relationship resulted in a lot of work for him, a couple of trials, and ultimately about 11 or 12 convictions on those serious felonies. He subsequently was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms in Washington prisons. I have stayed in touch with him and developed a relationship and ultimately a friendship with him over the last 40 years. In the last few years, he asked me to help him see if he could finally secure parole in his, I think it was his 40th year of incarceration. He's now actually in his 43rd year of incarceration. We started talking, and his interest in writing a book was basically to use the book as a platform to tell his story about spiritual and moral transformation that took place over the years since he's been in prison. He wants, if he's able to secure parole, to get out of prison and establish a ministry on behalf of the interests of particularly low-income African-American kids who are at risk of doing what he did in his life, which is ending up in prison. So that's really his motivation for having his story told. My motivation was to honor and celebrate his life for all the positive things that he's done in his life, but also to use the story to talk about some other things, to talk about what happens in the criminal justice system that involves implied or even explicit bias and discrimination against people of color, to talk about excessive sentencing, and to talk also about white privilege. The reason that white privilege comes into the book is I thought it might be an opportunity for me to develop and narrate the story of my life, which is really a life of white privilege, and compare that against the narrative describing Michael's life, and allow the reader to infer from that parallel narrative whatever they might absorb and learn about the difference in being born Black, poor, and neglected in the south side of Chicago versus being born to a relatively affluent family who gave me support and opportunities that couldn't have remotely have been understood or enjoyed or experienced by someone who came from Michael's background. So the white privilege part is important. Finally, and lastly, I was motivated and intrigued by telling a story that linked the experience of childhood neglect and abuse with the likelihood that that neglect and abuse could later manifest in criminal behavior. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the relationship of not giving young children what they need and what that means in terms of consequences later in their life.
Okay, thank you. Jeremiah, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your experiences, and what do you think one man's experience in the criminal legal system can tell us about the system as a whole?
I think one man's experience just can highlight the amount of transformation that can occur. I mean, Mr. Anderson, like myself, we both committed terrible crimes, notwithstanding the fact that I was 14 and he was 6 or 7 years older. And notwithstanding the most terrible acts we committed in our life, we managed to transform ourselves in an environment that really is not designed for that type of transformation. I don't think anybody would have ever expected that when I was being sentenced to life without parole, one day I would be in law school. It would have been absolutely absurd. And the entire basis of their punishment of a life sentence is the idea that you're irredeemable. Yet here I am, and there Michael is. And these are just two of countless stories that you never hear because of the nature of a life sentence. These people never get out. And for the relatively few that somehow manage to have a second opportunity at life, most of them just go about living their lives and you never hear anything about them. They're working, they're raising families, and I can assure you if they reoffended, you would hear about it. And the silence speaks volumes, and I think that is why a story like Michael's needs to be told, because it really speaks about not only transformation, but the nature of the criminal justice system, in that these sentences are handed out so easily, and yet nobody thinks about change and whether that should even bear on the calculus of punishment. And with respect to abuse and neglect, I think it's a part of all of those stories. I mean, I didn't even understand, because I was so young, just how impactful neglect is, supervisory neglect. You know, you think of abuse as something being physical, but apparently supervisory neglect can even leave more damage. And while there are all kinds of children out there that suffer these type of things, and many of them never commit a crime, I think that speaks more to the fact that some people are more resilient than others and have different types of circumstances and opportunities to be able to move past that. Whereas others, it is undoubtedly a contributing factor, because but for what I was experiencing in my early years, there's no way I would have been on the trajectory that would have led me to run away from home and take a man's life and be sentenced to life without parole when I was 14.
Okay. Thank you. George, I know that a lot of people, and Jeremiah will come back to you as well, a lot of people who are listening are lawyers or will soon be lawyers. And so maybe, of course, I had the opportunity to read the book, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about the experience of representing someone charged in, well, he had already been charged in one county with multiple counts of felonious activity. And now you and a counterpart who is about your same level of experience are supposed to defend him on 22 counts of, again, serious crimes, including crimes against the person. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And then Jeremiah, maybe we can follow up and you can talk a little bit about your experience dealing with lawyers throughout the process. And so we can sort of have a counterpoint discussion about the role of lawyers and your personal experience with lawyers, or being a lawyer, George.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, I write about this in the book, and I've reflected on a lot. And, you know, this was a long time ago, but I think I'm pretty clear in saying I was quite insecure about the responsibility of being a neophyte young lawyer with limited experience, taking on the responsibility of representing a man who was looking at very, very serious charges, who would likely end up spending his life in prison if he was convicted. My insecurity, didn't really have much to do with my work ethic. It didn't have to do with my lack of confidence in my ability to kind of do the raw legal work. I could research, I could write, I could do the analysis, I could put in the 15 and 18-hour days that I knew it would take. But I was insecure just around the issues of being able to act in a mature, confident, persuasive way with courts and jurors and prosecutors and, you know, the larger context of the system, because I was young, I was relatively inexperienced, and also it was a high-profile case. And I thought, gosh, how am I going to deal with this attention that I'm going to get from the press, and not just the attention, I was going to be in the hot seat because I was appointed to represent a man who was considered by the entire public, not just the judiciary and the prosecutors, as an irredeemable predator. Everyone had already decided this man was not just irredeemable, but that if he was ever allowed out into the community anywhere, he would continue doing bad things and hurt people. So I was in a position where I was very visibly connected to or associated with this man who was deemed to be not just a bad man, but he was, you know, virtually demonized in the press on a day-to-day basis over a period of many months while I was representing him. So, you know, the whole thing for me kind of contextually created both an opportunity for enormous professional growth for me, but also, you know, real stress. There was some real concern emotionally about how I was going to handle this going into it. Well, some of that changed as I got to know Michael Anderson. Some of that changed because I was able to start establishing a relationship with him early on. And I learned, it didn't take me too long to learn that, well, you know, in the end, I wasn't representing just a number or a client or a redeemable, you know, individual who had been, you know, charged with serious crimes. I was representing a man. I was representing a human being. And I understood as I got into it that my responsibility was not just a professional one. My responsibility was to learn about him so that I would be in a position to tell his story, not so much so that I could save him from prison, because his story was such that probably he was inevitably going to go to prison, at least for some period of time. But I nonetheless wanted him to have the confidence that he was being represented and that I was being an advocate that knew him and could be authentic in my ability to represent who he was and his interests to the criminal justice system.
Thanks, Jeremiah. Your experience dealing with lawyers, and maybe you can indicate whether that had any impact on your ultimate decision to join us at Gonzaga Law School.
You know, my experience was somewhat different. I had 3 sets of lawyers. And so when I was 14 and was originally confined, I was represented by a criminal defense attorney, had been practicing about 13, 14 years. And the takeaway from that is just the importance of trying to have the ability to establish a rapport with your client, especially when you're dealing with somebody that young. And kids naturally don't trust adults, yet here you are in a position where you need full disclosure from your client in order to try to best effectively represent them. And while he tried his best, in hindsight, there were a lot of facts that I probably could have imparted to him that would have gave him an opportunity to try to mitigate what was coming. But that lack of trust, just trying to build that with a child, basically, it was just a bridge too far. And 20 years later, when Miller versus Alabama was decided, which invalidated life without parole sentences, there were legislative changes that were made, which gave me an opportunity to be paroled. And I was represented by some nonprofit attorneys, highly educated, went to Ivy League law schools, Yale, Harvard, Georgetown, and it was their inability to see me as an intelligent person who can make rational decisions, even those that have legal consequences and require a legal analysis, which was a barrier to communication. And I will just give an example. There were particular arguments I wanted them to make to the parole board regarding the interpretation of the statute. And they just insisted on either not believing me or not wanting to put it forth. And I ended up having to present it in a law journal piece that ultimately got cited by the Court of Appeals and invalidated the policy. So when you look back at something like that, it's kind of strange that here I couldn't even get my lawyers to listen to me, but the Court of Appeals thought it made enough sense to cite it. And I think the third example, I was finally able to have an attorney like Dean Critchlow that actually saw the humanity in me. And they were pro bono attorneys from Perkins Coie, and it made the absolute difference. And the reason I'm here right now was because they were able to see me as a person with feelings, with intelligence, who can make smart choices, bad or good, but ultimately left it to me to be the driver with how I wanted my case to be presented. And they were counselors as opposed to somebody who was trying to dictate what they thought was best and go home, even if it goes right or wrong. And so I think I could have used Dean Critchlow many times throughout my time confined, but I'm glad to have him here now because it makes a difference.
Well, thank you. So maybe we can focus a little bit on this notion of redemption, because I think when we moved to this mode of extreme and excessive sentencing, we were basically sending the message that there is no possibility for redemption or rehabilitation. And so I think that George, your or Michael's story, at least in part, and maybe in large part, based on his plans for the future as well, have to do with a faith connection and have to do with his changing his spiritual perspective on things. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that aspect of redemption. And then Jeremiah, you have maybe a little bit different take on the notion of redemption, or the notion of rehabilitation, as we sometimes refer to it. So George, why don't you kick us off and talk about that aspect of the book and that aspect about people's lives.
So, what you bring up in your question is first a question of how do we measure or define rehabilitation? And then that leads to the question of, is rehabilitation truly, not just rhetorically, but truly a goal of the correctional system, both in this state and throughout the United States? Michael's situation mentally, emotionally, and spiritually changed as a result of him becoming a convert to evangelical Christianity. And that happened after about 13 years in prison. His continuing interest in faith as the basis for his life is everything for Michael. He's an evangelical Christian who is committed and constant and dedicated to the idea that his Christian principles, that entire evangelical ethos, guides his life in prison, and should he be paroled, it will guide his life when he's out of prison. But I want to relate this to the idea of both being Black and the idea of the concept of rehabilitation. I'm convinced, knowing Michael the last 43 years, and based on my experience in first representing him in the late 70s, and then following his life over the course of the last several decades, that he would probably be out and would have been paroled long ago if he had been a white guy. He was deemed to be a predator. He was demonized as a predator from the inner city of Chicago. He was treated that way by the prosecutor, He was treated that way by the judges. He was treated that way in the context of his sentencing and the recommendations that were made to the court by psychologists, by pre-sentence correctional officers, and really by everyone, including the press. He was characterized as a black man who was a demon who could never be allowed to be out. In the meantime, over the last several decades, I've run into many situations where white folks, white men, who have also done very serious crimes, including homicides, were paroled, were given a chance to show that they indeed had been rehabilitated and had gotten out, some of whom were Michael's colleagues and friends in prison, who he, saw go home years ago while he continued to stay in prison. I think race is a factor in that. Now, how does that relate to the question of rehabilitation? I think that when you convert realistically, honestly, and sincerely to a faith-based way of looking at yourself and looking at your relationship to other people, it's either going to be believed or not believed based on sort of a predisposition of who the person is. And in Michael's case, even though he converted and changed his life and his behavior and his relationships 30 years ago, he has still tended to be seen as the guy he was in the late 1970s. There's obvious evidence that he has changed. It's objective evidence. It can be measured. He's clearly rehabilitated. People on one level know he's rehabilitated. But when you look into the records of his parole hearings and the manner in which he's been treated for decades, it's pretty obvious that people in the correctional system, including parole members of the parole board, will go back to and focus on who he was when he was 24 years old, when he was dangerous, when he was hurting people. They generally go back to that focus, and it's very, very hard for them to sort of look at the larger context of his life, his development, his faith. And I'm not sure, although I don't necessarily have the statistics to demonstrate this in an objective way, but I'm pretty sure that if he was white, that same sort of obsession about who he was when he was a dangerous young black man would not be as compelling to all the correctional people as it has been over the years with Michael Anderson.
Jeremiah, your thoughts on rehabilitation / redemption, and maybe we can also talk a little bit about relationships that sustain people, either do or don't, because George, you had this 43-year relationship with Michael. He also was married and his wife stood by him all of that time. And so maybe we can talk about, integrate that into our discussion as well, because I don't know if people necessarily, when they take on a legal case, anticipate that they will have a 40+ year relationship, friendship, etc. But Jeremiah, maybe you can speak to rehabilitation, redemption, and the people who were important to you in this process that you went through.
Oh, well, one thing about what actually brings about that transformation for Michael, it was obviously his faith. But for me, to be frank, it was anger. It was anger at the things I was seeing happening in prison, whether it was prisoners victimizing each other or officers victimizing prisoners. And I had a friend of mine who had committed suicide next door to me when we were in solitary confinement. And he had been sentenced to about 60 years when he was 16, and I had just lost my final appeal. And it was at that moment throughout in the weeks thereafter that I realized that either I was going to have to find something that would keep me going, notwithstanding losing everyone and never getting out of prison, or I was going to end up a nihilist or a suicide victim. And I decided that I wanted to start studying the law. And if nothing else, I can help those around me, even if I had never got out of prison again. And so that's what I did. And that's what kept me moving forward. But it's unique for everyone. Somebody might have a nephew that they just want to be in their life and be able to watch them grow. For some, it's religion. For it can be any of number of things, but it's the thing that keeps you going, even though you're in an environment that isn't focused on rehabilitation. And with respect to relationships, I was lucky to have two important ones. My sister was in my life throughout the time I was confined. She was paying for me to take distance learning courses, so I was able to earn my bachelor's degree when I was incarcerated. And also my fiance, we went to school together when we were kids and reconnected about 7 years before my release. And she stood by my side throughout those years. It's the only reason I managed to write or publish anything during that period, because she was basically, she was my conduit to the outside world. And so having people like that in your life is, for me, it was essential. But there's some that manage to continue transforming themselves without that, but that doesn't underestimate just how important having loved ones is. But with respect to the Department of Corrections and parole officers, like Michael's, still looking at him, who he was over 40 years ago, while he was still in the brain maturation stage, and still seeing that person in this 60-something-year-old man, that is absolutely on point. Because even today, while I'm at law school, I can't leave the county without getting permission beforehand. They don't want you hanging around old associates because they might be triggers or criminogenic environments. And you think about, my old associates were 14 when I was confined, and now you're talking about middle-aged men and criminogenic environments. It's just a way of thinking that here you would still talk about the triggers that led a 14-year-old to commit a terrible crime, and believing that those same triggers or circumstances exist 40 years later. And it's just a mindset why they would see him, Michael, who he was back then, and not be able to really genuinely see the person that he's developed to now.
Mary Pat, can I ask JJ a question that might advance the dialogue a little bit? You know, in Michael's case, it wasn't just faith. It was partly the fact that he had a wife who was dedicated to him, who loved him. You know, they had 3 children. He now has both grandchildren, and he has 15 great-grandchildren.
Wow.
So, you know, he's got this expansive family that's, you know, just wonderful and committed to him, and he's committed to them. And it'll be wonderful when, you know, to look at his life evolve once he gets out and he's able to connect with his larger family. But the question I have is, what about the role and the opportunity for people to get counseling? I mean, there's religion, yes, as a basis for change, transformation. In Michael's case, he spent several years doing some intensive counseling where he was able, with a counselor that he respected who was competent, he was able to sort of peel off the layers of his life that had caused him to feel so bad about himself, to understand what he didn't get as a child, and for the first time as a more mature man to sort of take a look at how all of this had happened and what the ingredients were that had caused him to be so antisocial when he was younger. And that was very important to him to get sort of the intellectual and emotional knowledge that he needed, in addition to the support that he got through his faith-based transformation. And I'm asking JJ if in general that seems to be available in the prison system, and if it is available, is it something that people take advantage of, or does it just kind of depend on where they're at in their own, you know, sort of personal growth?
So it is available, but prison is all about maintaining order and security. So that still continues even in a counseling setting, because the objective is less therapeutic and more with getting you to be able to maintain your behavior in such a way that you don't threaten the orderly operation of the facility. And so finding the ingredients to one's deviance and being able to give you the tools in order to demonstrate pro-social behavior, it's less that and more psychotropic drugs, infrequent counseling sessions just to make sure that you're stable, i.e. not going to threaten the orderly operation of the facility. So, and the second thing, notwithstanding the fact that there are good counselors like obviously Michael had, you really do need a leap of faith, because all of those records can be utilized by parole authorities when it comes to making a determination as to whether you should be released. So you can reveal something that is critical from a counseling perspective in order to try to get past it and work through it and get rid of whatever demons you might have had or that are still plaguing you. But that very thing might then be weaponized against you years down the road, notwithstanding the fact that you've obviously transformed yourself and been able to manage because of it. So it is not only the threat of future repercussions, but the knowledge that the counseling is there more as a tool of your captors. Those two things ultimately are a barrier to a lot of people going and receiving any type of therapy or counseling, myself included.
So thank you. I would say we will take about 5 minutes to maybe talk about some criminal justice reform efforts that could be beneficial, at least from the perspective of Jeremiah and George. And then we'll have some time for questions. So we wanted to leave 15 minutes or so for questions. So if you do have some questions, you could put them in the chat feature and we will circle back to you. But I think that if we talk about criminal justice or the criminal legal system reform efforts, we've touched on a variety of them, like early intervention. We didn't really talk too much about addiction or perhaps the whole notion of people with mental disabilities and how that might be approached differently. But if we want to dramatically reduce the prison population, if we want to look at extreme sentencing options or alternatives, because we have this increasing geriatric population in the prison. So now we're seeing some motivation on the part of the law and order types to maybe reduce the prison population for economic reasons and so forth. But maybe George and Jeremiah, if you wanted to just top two prison reform efforts that you think would make a difference and might be doable.
Well, yes, mass incarceration and extreme sentencing is not the result of evidence-based analysis of behavior and behavioral change. It's about politics and fear and racism. Our prison population is the result of legislative decisions at the federal level and the states level made in the 1980s and the 1990s, which is a result of the war on drugs and the idea that if you're going to be elected and be popular politically, it's necessary to convince voters that you're going to be tough on crime. Now, this is not necessarily the same in Western Europe, and particularly the Scandinavian countries, where they understand that people grow out of crime. You may be 15 or 20 years old and do terrible things, but by the time you're 40 or 45, it's likely statistically that you're not going to be as inclined to commit crimes. So in some countries, they have maximum sentences, even for terrible behavior, that's maybe 20 years. And they have a system of corrections that will prepare people to participate in society in constructive and meaningful ways, knowing that they're going to be out of prison in 20 years, as opposed to just the expectation that we'll throw them away for the rest of their life and not have to worry about them. And as you said, Mary Pat, one of the understandings that might bring conservative people and more progressive minded people together is this idea that, you know, it's a lot cheaper to invest in people than it is to pay for people to be housed throughout the course of their life. And of course, and this is true in Michael's case, as you get older, there's medical costs and other costs associated with incarceration that are really extraordinary. And we pay for that as taxpayers. So I think, you know, there is this understanding that people who care about the humanitarian side of this can maybe partner with the people who are primarily motivated by saving taxpayer money and come up with some solutions that result in people not spending so much time in prison, helping them develop so they can be constructive, they can participate in society when they get out, and then maybe taking some of those savings that are now dedicated to the criminal justice system and the correctional system, and taking some of that money and dedicating it to taking care of the emotional and the material needs of young people who are neglected or otherwise unsupported, in the hope that they don't end up in the prison system to begin with.
Thank you.
I think one thing in particular is those who were between ages 18 and 25 when they committed their crimes, because as Dean Critchlow noted, these are all political decisions. And even though the science demonstrates that people are still maturing up until the age of 25, there's an arbitrary limit at age 18 where all of a sudden, presto changeo, you're treated just as if you're a 43-year-old man. And, you know, I benefited from the fact that I was under 18. That's the reason I'm here right now, that my transformation was enough to get me to the streets. But I think it's important to recognize that even between the ages of 18 and 25, when my brain was still developing, I was committing crimes in prison. I have a custodial assault on an officer at age 18 and several other staff assaults around the age 21. And these are felonies. I was prosecuted for them. And so the fact that I went from a violent young offender to a violent older teen and early 20s-year-old man to a law student and Knight of Columbus, I think that speaks to just how much change can occur, not only when it comes to somebody that is under age 25, but for somebody who is completely aged out of crime, like Mr. Anderson and the countless people who remain imprisoned and don't have an opportunity for any type of release mechanism due to either the sentence that was originally imposed or the nature of parole boards.
Thank you. So we do have a few questions that have been posted, and I think the first one is actually a multi-part question. So I'm going to break it down, and I hope I can stay true to the intent of the questioner. But I think the first part of the question, George, is directed to you. How long did it take for you to see and feel the humanness of not only Michael Anderson, but maybe some of your other criminal clients? And what do you think influenced you to see them through this different lens?
Well, I think I was unusually lucky in having an understanding that advocacy involved human relationships that carried with it a responsibility to connect with people as human beings and not just in our roles as client and as lawyers. And in my case, I was lucky because I had a father who was a trial lawyer who did lots of criminal defense work. And he was amazing in terms of his ability to connect with clients and his ability to talk to judges and talk to juries in a very human way about people that wasn't overly legalistic or academic or false. And, you know, it wasn't that I necessarily had that quality that was inborn in terms of who I was, but I was able to sort of watch it and understand it and come to the conclusion that that's the kind of relationship I wanted with my clients. So it didn't take me too long to figure out that if you wanted to take care of people, you had to know them and you had to treat them as people, not just clients, and you had to be vulnerable with them in terms of disclosing something of who you were, as opposed to finding out just who they were.
Okay, thank you. And Jeremiah, you wanted to respond to maybe a different aspect of this question because you're not George, so you can't respond to that. But I think there was also a question about sort of looking at the issue of white privilege and how we talk about that, and under what circumstances do we think that maybe this is used in a way that's off-putting and is maybe provides excuses, or just is a way to maybe not walk the talk in the way that would be actually meaningful to people who find themselves in the criminal legal system. So if you feel comfortable talking about that, that would be great.
I can see how that term white privilege could be off-putting, because a lot of times it comes in a context where it's as if the person is supposed to feel some type of guilt because of their immutable characteristics. But I think a better way to look at it is you are privileged to be white, because that's just the history of this country. That is a privilege to actually be that, as opposed to Black or any other minority. And that's not nothing to be mad or sad about. It's just a historical reality. And I think when it really was crystallized for me is when I started seeing white kids getting sentenced to life without parole in large numbers on national television. And I remember looking at these kids, and they just looked so adorable. Just like, my God, they could be anybody's child. And then it hit me, and I said, I'm about to get out of prison one day, because this is not about to continue. And whether that had anything to do with race or not, I don't know. But that is the thought that came to my head. And I think it just speaks to the fact that so much of this is defined by the color of one's skin, that it really is a privilege to not have to have this complexion and be sitting in front of a sentencing judge or jury. And it's just a reality of the criminal justice system in the United States.
Thank you. Yeah, I think some people might be familiar with the Serial podcast season 3 that focuses on the Cuyahoga County criminal legal system, so the Cleveland area. And I think Sarah Koenig, the producer, at one point quotes from a defense attorney, and he says, "It never hurts to be white in the system, and it never helps to be Black." And so I think that's sort of a pithy capture of what we're talking about. So we do have a couple of other questions. One from Professor Ann Murphy, and she, of course, with her master's degree in economics, wants to ask, or is asking, how much do for-profit prisons play in lengthier sentencing processes?
I wish I knew the answer to that, and others who are participating may have some up-to-date information on that. I haven't studied closely where the private prison system is currently in the United States. However, anecdotally, I've read articles, talked to people, had discussions about the extent to which the idea that prisons are economic engines for profit and for the investors and the shareholders of those companies that own those prisons is very, very problematic. It creates obvious conflicts. The extent to which those prisons consume a lot of resources in the country versus, public institutions, I just can't answer that. I don't know. Maybe someone else does.
I think the private prisons, where they come into play is the strength of their lobbying. And there's been stories exposing just how much of an impact they have had through their lobbying efforts with respect to legislatures passing sentencing bills. And so while it's indirect in a sense of it's not, they build them and the people will come, it is more, they have a say through their economic and lobbying power to actually produce a result that will lead those people to come. But I think the correctional unions are just as powerful. For instance, California's, they have an extremely powerful correctional unit that has been supportive, 3 strikes and other measures that even today we look back on and realize might have been one step too far, but nevertheless, getting those laws amended is extremely difficult when you have those type of interests involved. And it really should be concerning when it's involving people's lives.
So yes, I think that we have some overt examples. For example, the Luzerne County, Pennsylvania Kids for Cash scandal, where actually the judges were, skimming some big off the top for sending kids to particular locales. And I think we also have the notion of increased privatization of immigration detention facilities and sort of seeing how that has played out. But we have a couple more questions. I think that one of the questions is the data supports people growing out of crime. And so sentencing, life sentences that seem overly punitive. So should there be an elimination of other types of long-term supervision, such as community supervision or sex offender registration? So these things that keep people tethered to the system, maybe not confined, but still tethered and part of this sort of prison industrial complex, so to speak.
Well, I'm not necessarily well studied on those questions. I would say, though, my own personal response is anything that allows people to get out of the prison system, the institutions themselves, and to reconnect with communities and families is a positive, contribution to their lives and potentially to the communities. If there has to be some level of supervision, some amount of monitoring to ensure that everyone feels good about that, I'm okay with that. There may be some programs, some supervisory structures that are questionable in terms of whether they work, whether they're effective, whether they're just producing money for vested interests or not. I would just like to see Michael Anderson get out. I don't care if he has to check in every month with a parole officer. I'd like him to go home and see his wife and his kids and his grandkids and do the ministry that he wants. That's my primary interest at this point, is let's get these people out of prison.
So I felt exactly like Dean Critchlow did when I was sitting in prison. But now that I'm out, the community supervision has become more of a reality. And I think that lifetime supervision, even for sex offenders, should not be there. First, I don't believe the data supports that those supervisory conditions are actually reducing recidivism. But more importantly, they cause increased stressors. Michael will get out after spending almost 43 years in prison. He's going to be an elderly man, a man of faith who just wants to spend time with his grandchildren. Re-entry is going to be difficult enough for him. I mean, I had a panic attack in a criminal law classroom just watching a video. And with all the stressors he's going to be going through, having to call and get permission to go to his grandchildren's house or to go camping or to be paranoid when his wife is driving that she might go across the county line on a wrong turn, I think is doing more harm than good.
So thank you. I guess it's about time to wrap things up because we try to stay on time. And I'm hopeful that this will be the first of an ongoing dialogue about some of the issues that brought everyone here today: mass incarceration, excessive sentencing, criminal defense practice, humanity of individuals who find themselves in the system, especially young Black men, and also our relationships with one another. So I think that we have a couple of questions sort of out there, and we may have the opportunity to address them either individually, but thank you all for joining us. Thank you for the center for putting this on, and thank you most particularly to George Critchlow and Jeremiah Bourgeois for sharing their experiences with us. And George, you'll tell us when the book comes out so we can all buy it, right?
It's going to be out in November. I don't know what day, but it should be out in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.